It's the news story of the week. And for the energy sector, it's the news of the year. The United Arab Emirates has slammed the door and walked out of the group. And not exactly the WhatsApp group, but OPEC, the organization of the petroleum exporting countries, and by extension also OPEC Plus, the expanded version of the club. Effective immediately as of this May the 1st, the Emirates will go it alone when it comes to their crude oil production. They will no longer have to abide by OPEC's decisions and quotas. As you all surely know, we're talking about a group of countries known as the oil cartel, which accounts for nearly 4 out of every 10 barrels extracted worldwide, and about 80% of proven conventional crude oil reserves. It's a club whose main objective is to adjust production quotas so that producers can guarantee a high level of revenue without compromising the global supply of crude oil. As I said, a classic cartel. And of course, on paper, being part of a club that basically serves to maximize oil revenues seems pretty good. So why leave? What's more, the UAE isn't just any member. With a production of about 3.5 million barrels per day just before the war in Iran began, it was the club's third largest producer after Saudi Arabia, basically considered the group's leader, and Iraq. And not only that, but it's the only country, along with Saudi Arabia, that had what is known as spare capacity. In other words, it is prepared to quickly adjust its production. It was therefore a very important member. A member that had been part of this club since 1967. First, the Emirate of Abu Dhabi joined, and 4 years later, the entire country following its independence and unification. We're talking about 6 long decades. So, obviously, even though relations between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh are never fantastic, the news has taken everyone by surprise. Although the truth is that it may make sense for Abu Dhabi, and it also has a significant impact on both the most important cartel of all time and the rest of the planet. Well, we've made this video precisely to clarify everything this move entails. We're going to explain in detail why the United Arab Emirates has decided to slam the door. Who does this decision benefit and who does it harm? What will it mean for us as oil consumers? How is this decision related to the war in Iran? And why are so many people saying that this is a victory for Trump? Well, I'll tell you right now that there is much more to this story than a simple economic or industrial decision. There's a bit of everything here. Economic motives, strategic struggles among Gulf countries, pressure from the United States, and even a possible shift in the economic model. So fire up your engines because we're heading straight to the heart of the Middle East. Let's go. But first, if you're interested in the world of investing, if you want to learn how to manage your savings, protect yourself against inflation, and figure out how to make money beyond your day job, I've got some good news for you. At Visual Factory, we've created the Visual Factory Club, a newsletter where every week we send out free content focused on essential financial education, the ABC of what everyone should know to understand the stock market, financial markets in general, investment platforms, how to assess investment opportunities, and which markets may have more or less potential. Because of course, if you want to invest your money so you're not at the mercy of your country's economic instability, you at least need to understand the basics of the financial world. In the Visual Factory Club, you'll learn all of this completely free of charge. Through the link below and this QR code, you can sign up for the club and start receiving the upcoming editions. What's more, when you sign up, you'll receive a dossier where I explain, in a clear and simple way, the most essential investment concepts. What multiples or the PE ratio are, what indices are, ETFs, derivatives, funds, EPS, you get the idea. After that, every week, you'll receive additional materials and market analysis to help you stay informed about what's going on. And by the way, the sooner you sign up, the better. Since we send each episode of the series by email, and every edition is unique, if you're not subscribed, you might miss some of them, and you won't be able to access them later. But with that said, let's get into the video. VisualPolitik community, the idea behind the club was for the producing countries to gain total control of the international oil market. Their decisions were meant to prevent major imbalances that would plummet their revenues or jeopardize their own business model. Keep in mind that oil is a commodity, and if production isn't controlled, when prices rise, supply can skyrocket, causing prices and revenues to plummet for many years. On the other hand, if prices suddenly spike too high, that could lead to much greater investment in other countries, which could cause competition to grow unchecked. Or it could also accelerate the transition from oil to other energy sources. In any case, these two consequences could reduce the profits of traditional producers. That's why OPEC was founded, to stabilize the market and maximize its revenues without running the risk of killing the golden goose. And so far, it has worked. But of course, that also implies there is a common policy, one that not everyone may agree with, or that may not necessarily serve the interests of all members. In fact, the United Arab Emirates isn't the first country in the Middle East to leave this organization, but the second. Any idea which one came first? Well,
December 3rd, 2018. Qatar to leave OPEC as cartel pressured to cut production. The nation, which has long played a key role inside the cartel, will focus on boosting natural gas production.
exactly, Qatar. And here's the thing. Think about this. Limiting supply raises prices, but it also forces you to be subject to a multilateral organization, to be controlled, and ultimately, that can reduce sales. Yes, you can make more money per barrel, and that generates stable revenue, but if they limit the number of barrels you can put on the market, the trade-off might not be worth it. And this is exactly what they have been calculating in the Emirati palaces, because there comes a point where strategies that work well for some members no longer work for others, and that can happen for many reasons. Pay close attention to everything we're about to tell you next.
Leading the way?
Well, the first thing you need to be clear about is what the impact the United Arab Emirates' exit from this club has. And the answer is quick. In the short term, likely little to none. In fact, oil prices barely flinched at the news. But in the longer term, things could be different. Look, the UAE currently, before the war, produced just over 4% of the world's crude oil, although its reserves are estimated at around 111 billion barrels, which amounts to 1/10 of all known conventional reserves. Pay close attention to this difference, because it could mark a turning point in the energy market as we know it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To put it simply, there are at least 4 reasons why leaving the club is very appealing to the Emirates. First, because there are countries that could potentially have much more extraction capacity than they can utilize. Second, because the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz and the bottleneck have shifted the incentives. Third, due to pressure from the United States, particularly from Donald Trump, to increase production and lower prices. Although this is not out of altruism, as we will see later. And fourth, because the energy transition in developed countries is forcing many producers to radically change their strategy. So, if you're ready, let's start with the first reason. Pay attention. The UAE wants to stretch out the black gold. To that end, in 2022, the Abu Dhabi Oil Company announced a massive investment plan for the 2023 to 2027 period, totaling $150 billion. A massive sum that, among other things, aims to increase the country's production capacity to 5 million barrels per day by 2027, 3 years ahead of their initial target of reaching that figure by 2030. And the question is, why is OPEC a problem? Well, you see, the problem is this. Currently, the United Arab Emirates has a stated maximum production capacity of 4.85 million barrels per day, about 13% of OPEC's total capacity. Of that amount, just before the war, it was only able to produce around 3.4 million due to the group's quotas.
In other words, they have a large amount of excess capacity that is not being utilized and which is therefore limiting returns. In fact, the UAE, along with Saudi Arabia, is one of the countries known as swing producers, those that can quickly increase or reduce production to influence prices. We're talking about how, within 3 to 6 months, they could activate their full capacity and put an additional 1.5 million barrels on the market if they were allowed to do so.
The problem? Well, you could probably guess what it is. They simply couldn't do it. And who's to blame for that? Well, here's the interesting part, because we have to point the finger directly at Saudi Arabia. The fact is, Riyadh, as I mentioned earlier, is the de facto leader of OPEC, because it is by far the world's largest exporter. And the problem is that the Saudis are fully immersed in an ambitious plan called Vision 2030 to diversify their economy and reduce their dependence on oil. A plan that comes with a stratospheric price tag. Take a look.
Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 projects reach $1.3 trillion in value.
We're not going to explain what this plan is all about because we already dedicated an entire video to it a while back. But basically, it's a cocktail of the most megalomaniacal projects you can imagine. And of course, what's the problem? Well, Saudi Prince bin Salman's plan to transform his country is wreaking havoc on the national budget. To give you an idea, a fiscal deficit of over $44 billion is projected for this year, which amounts to 3.3% of Saudi GDP. That doesn't seem like much, but of course, we have to take into account the current context of sky-high oil prices. Do you see where this is going now?
Although Saudi oil extraction costs are very low, similar to those of Emirati crude, the Saudis have no interest in flooding the oil market right now. In fact, They would need prices per barrel to remain stable between $90 and $95 to balance their books. This is what is known as the break-even price, which, mind you, doesn't have to be reached but does serve as a benchmark.
Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates' finances are in a radically different situation. They have a surplus of more than 5%, and they only need the price per barrel to be $50 to keep their finances healthy. In other words, for the Emiratis, anything above $50 per barrel for oil exports is fine. So why the train wreck? Because the Emirates don't need such high prices. Even if they increased production and the price fell, they would still be in the black and could even retain most of their revenue. In turn, higher production and lower prices slow down the global energy transition. Put another way, the Emiratis are primarily focused on extending their business model for many more years. In contrast, in Riyadh, they need to maximize their revenue now. Do you see the difference? This is the first of 3 clashes. 2 visions, 2 objectives, 2 conflicting interests.
The UAE has taken a sovereign decision in line with its long-term energy strategy, its true production capability, and its national interest, as well as global energy market stability. The UAE's decision to exit OPEC reflects a policy-driven evolution aligned with long-term market fundamentals.
And of course, by leaving OPEC, they will be able to produce and export as much as they want without being subject to quotas or limitations. And above all, they are no longer under Riyadh's control, which has a lot to do with this other idea. We're all too familiar with the disaster caused by the decision of the United States and Israel to get involved in a large-scale war against Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is closed, oil prices are skyrocketing, and Iran has attacked numerous energy facilities with its drones. Nevertheless, Saudi Arabia seems in no hurry. It appears to be relatively comfortable with what is happening. The fact is, they are routing a significant portion of their oil exports through the Red Sea, to the point that the rise in prices has almost offset the drop in export volume. And the longer the situation drags on, the higher oil price estimates climb for the coming years, which is exactly what they want. Which is exactly what Abu Dhabi wants. In other words, Riyadh is taking advantage of this crisis to consolidate its energy policy, and the Emiratis aren't happy about that at all. So, a slam of the door. Now, if you thought this was all about oil, hold on a moment because there's more. What if I told you that the United Arab Emirates leaving OPEC could, in a way, also be a victory for Donald Trump and a major diplomatic success for the sheikhs of Abu Dhabi and Dubai? Why am I saying this? Well, take a look. Pay attention to what Donald Trump said in 2018 at the United Nations during his first time in the White House.
And OPEC nations are, as usual, ripping off the rest of the world. And I don't like it. Nobody should like it. We defend many of these nations for nothing. And then they take advantage of us by giving us high oil prices. Not good.
One of Trump's long-standing obsessions has always been OPEC. For him, this cartel is responsible for the high energy prices Americans pay, and his clashes with the group have been the norm for years. Trump is obsessed with making oil cheaper. He wants the United States to produce more, but he wants every barrel of crude or every gallon of fuel to be cheaper. He believes that this would consolidate the United States' energy power, make him hugely popular with families, and delay the energy transition. Does this sound familiar? Exactly. It's the same approach as the UAE's, an approach not shared by either OPEC or OPEC+. But now Abu Dhabi has slammed the door. And look, it's not like the impact is going to be huge, but it sets an important precedent, and perhaps it will help ease tensions in this market. Also, take a look at this chart. In the 1970s, OPEC controlled about half of global oil production, which gave them almost total control over prices and allowed them to use oil as a geopolitical weapon. We need to look no further than the 1973 crisis, when OPEC decided to stop exporting oil to countries that had supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. However, this club's share now hovers between 30 and 35% of global production, meaning that 7 out of every 10 barrels produced in the world today are not under its control. And now, with the departure of the Emiratis, that figure is rising. In other words, when viewed up close, perhaps the UAE isn't that important. Within the club, they were important, but not crucial. However, if we take a broader view, then this move could already be a massive blow to OPEC, whose control over global production could fall below 30%. And even though with OPEC Plus they're much more, the UAE's exit alone could end up dragging other countries along with it. In other words, this move greatly weakens the old cartel. And keep in mind that the United States' role here may have been more significant than it appears. Just look at this news story.
UAE asks US about a wartime financial lifeline.
Let's be clear, the UAE's fiscal situation is very robust. It is by far the richest place on the face of the earth. But there is a war, and the sheikhs there fear that the effects of the war could hit them harder than expected. For example, that their currency might depreciate rapidly. The fact is that the Emirati dirham, which is pegged to the dollar and backed by the foreign reserves of $270 billion, is not having the best of times. The war has put it under enormous pressure due to the risks of capital flight, stock market volatility, and the departure of many foreigners, whom it may take time to bring back.
That is why the country's central bank proposed a currency swap line with the United States a couple of weeks ago. Through this, the UAE central bank would have much cheaper access to dollars to support its currency and bolster its foreign exchange reserves in case the war ends up triggering a liquidity crisis.
What's more, some analysts are even suggesting that Abu Dhabi's exit from the oil cartel may have been a precondition for some form of US assistance. The exit in exchange for a large-scale agreement on financial matters, and perhaps also political and military ones. Keep an eye on this theory. If decades ago the petrodollar was primarily a construct between Riyadh and Washington, we may now be facing a new agreement that gives the UAE a much larger role. And don't forget that the UAE is Israel's key ally in the region. In fact, we recently reported on how IDF troops are supporting the air defense of a territory that has recently made headlines with news as shocking as this.
Israel sent Iron Dome system, dozens of IDF soldiers to UAE during Iran war.
Pay close attention to this sort of triangle between Washington, Jerusalem, and Abu Dhabi. But if everything we've told you is already reason enough, there's still one last issue that could explain the decision to leave the club, a possible long-term shift in the UAE's economic strategy. It turns out that 3/4 of the United Arab Emirates economy no longer depends directly on black gold. This country's case is possibly the most successful diversification of an oil state in history.
Sectors such as trade, finance, construction, and tourism have become the new engines driving the economy, ensuring it no longer relies solely on oil.
But that doesn't mean the Emiratis want to give up their golden goose. As we've seen before, what they actually want to do is extend that business into the future, and they also want to develop a new activity much further. I'm talking about, in a way, following in Qatar's footsteps and boosting gas production and exports. And the fact is that gas, as you know, is by far the energy source that backs up renewables when there's no wind to turn the wind turbines, or no sun to power the solar panels. In other words, it's a crucial energy source in the energy transition. To give you an idea, Shell estimates suggest that demand for liquefied natural gas could grow by between 45 and 85% by 2050, compared to 2025. And you might ask, what does gas have to do with leaving OPEC, which focuses on oil? Well, it's quite simple. Much of the gas extracted in the Arab basins is what's known as associated gas. In other words, pockets of gas that are accessed because oil is being extracted. So when the cartel imposes crude oil production cuts, it simultaneously forces Emiratis to leave not only the oil, but also the gas that comes with it underground. And with that, they're losing a fortune. And that's not all. At this point, we come to the second pillar they're pursuing for the future, becoming a global producer of green energy. In fact, although it may come as a surprise to you, the country already operates some of the largest solar plants in the world. And with that energy combined with gas, they aim to become the world's largest producer of hydrocarbon, a raw material that will serve to decarbonize heavy industry, particularly the metallurgical and chemical sectors, and even transportation, since in the future many trucks and ships could run on hydrogen. In other words, we're talking about a medium, long, and very long-term strategy in which they're already considering transitioning from being an oil giant to a hydrogen giant, just in case things move faster than expected. And that's where OPEC gets in the way. Anyway, as you can see, there are plenty of reasons that have led the United Arab Emirates to leave OPEC. And although the effects on prices won't be immediate, greater competition and increased production are always good news for countries without oil, especially if it sparks a race to produce more. So the big question is, will we see a trickle of Arab countries leaving the organization in an effort to produce more oil, as Abu Dhabi has done? Based on what we've told you, do you think this move could pay off for them? Well, leave your opinions below in the comments and let's see what you think. But first, something very important: if you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik so you don't miss any updates. It's just a quick click that literally takes a second and it helps us out a lot. Once again, thank you so much for being here. Take care. I'll see you in the next video.